Hello, I want to show you how to use some LogiX nodes here, the um, Dynamic Impulse receiver and the Dynamic Impulse trigger. A couple people asked about those and I used them in a project a few days ago, so it is fresh in my mind how they can be used. These LogiX nodes are used to send messages back and forth between different LogiX components without having to actually connect them with little LogiX lines. So that's useful in a few scenarios. Maybe you have a whole bunch of duplicate objects and you want to send a message to all of them, or you want to loop through a bunch of objects and send a message to one at a time without connecting lines to each of them, or you have dynamically generated objects that are not present at the time you're hooking up the LogiX, so they get spawned by other code and you want to talk to them after they get spawned. Or maybe you want to make some sort of interface where future components made by you or other people can be sort of plugged into it and they will talk to each other automatically without changing any LogiX. By the way, I apologize for the gloves instead of proper hands, but I just got the index controllers today and I haven't had time to change my avatar to set the tool anchors pointing in the right position for the new controllers. Okay, so as an example of the dynamic impulse trigger and receiver that don't send a value, they just send a impulse. We'll say we have the sphere here. If we wanted to just toggle its visibility with regular LogiX without any of the dynamic impulse stuff, we would just take a reference to the sphere here, and we could use a Boolean latch to toggle its active field. We'll set its output to the active field, and we'll give it a pulse that toggles it. So every time you click this, it will toggle on and off, active, inactive. Now, if you had a whole bunch of those, you'd have to hook up these LogiX wires to every single one. And let's say that we don't want to do that. So instead of having a hookup here, what we're going to do is take a dynamic impulse receiver that receives the message, and that is just going to go into the Boolean latch here. And we have to give it a name because the messages are passed around according to, you give them a name so it knows what objects to pass a message on to. So we'll just call this toggle sphere visibility, or togsviz for short. And then to send the message, we'll set a dynamic impulse trigger that has to have the exact same name or tag. And there's just a impulse input so we can trigger it for testing. And this slot here is the hierarchy that you want it to send the message into. Now, that means that this receiver right here has to be located within the hierarchy that you're targeting here. So you have to make sure that you put your LogiX nodes into that hierarchy. If they're sitting in the root and this isn't pointing to the root, then it's not going to work. Now let's open up the inspector. Now I'm going to find my sphere here, and I'll just create a LogiX object, and we'll pack the LogiX into there. And then the LogiX will be in the same hierarchy as the sphere. So, sphere, LogiX, the regular old set packing route. Then I can just pack this LogiX in there to make sure it's in the correct hierarchy. And then, since I'm still working on it, I can just unpack it again. And that ensures that all those nodes, including the important one, the Dynamic Impulse Receiver, are in the correct hierarchy here. So now our sender will just target the sphere here. So take the sphere slot, set that as the hierarchy that it's going to be sending the dynamic impulse into. Now it should see there's no connection between these two sets of LogiX nodes, but if I hit pulse, well, apparently it doesn't work. It didn't work because I spelled sphere wrong in this one. I said toggle SHP instead of SPH. So yes, the tags really do matter. Okay, you can see it receives the impulse. Let's hook that up to the latch there. So yes, now when I hit pulse, you can see the sphere turns on and off, even though the LogiX are not connected with any of these wires here. Now, it doesn't have to be pointing, what am I saying? This has to point at a parent of where this dynamic impulse receiver is located, but it could be further down the hierarchy. So, if we look at our sphere, I can go in there and make sure that the LogiX is nested a few levels deeper. So, if I can, still getting used to the new controllers here. Okay, so now the LogiX is 1, 2, 3, 4 levels further down, and this should still work fine. I guess you could theoretically target the root with your impulse, but that probably wouldn't be a good idea because it would be trying to see if everything in the whole scene wants to accept the impulse. So I would assume that it's good to get your slot that you're targeting as far down the hierarchy as you can so it doesn't try to send your dynamic impulse to too awfully many things. So that doesn't appear to have any advantage over just hooking up a wire here, but for example, I didn't plan this out very well, but if I go into the root and create something that holds a whole bunch of spheres, the dynamic impulse we can see will send to all of them at once without hooking up any additional LogiX. Now I do have to change the impulse such that it goes to the spheres thing that contains them all. There we go. So I need to change the slot that that's pointing to so that it hits all of them. Okay, so there's the pulse. Now, without changing any LogiX at all, if I go and make copies of this, the dynamic impulse still hits all of them. So that is one potential use, is if you want to duplicate things arbitrarily and have them all receive the same message without editing the LogiX. That works. Just to demonstrate that the dynamic impulse trigger doesn't have to send a message to everything at once, it can send a message to one thing at a time. This loops through all of the children of a slot and sends this dynamic impulse trigger to one child at a time with a half-second delay in between them. So if I hit the pulse here, you can see the spheres appear one at a time. Now, the dynamic impulse trigger with value is a little trickier. It's not that it's complicated to use, but it's complicated to get the nodes set up, because the one that you pull out of the nodes menu can't actually be used. It has a dummy data type, which doesn't work. So if you look at the dynamic impulse receiver with value and the dynamic impulse trigger with value, they are not really much more complicated. It's just that they have the trigger has a value input down here, and the receiver has a value output. And other than that, they have the same tag that has to match between the trigger and receiver and the slot hierarchy you're targeting and the impulse in and the impulse out. It just sends a value along with the impulse. The thing that makes these tricky is that you can't actually attach anything to these. The dummy values don't adapt to accept any data type, like there's an integer input. Well, okay. Maybe the trigger is easier to use than I thought, because that did change. Maybe it's only the receiver that you have to manually create some components on it. You see I'm trying to drag a wire here, and that type doesn't change. And you can't drag it to anything else. So what you actually have to do is go into the inspector, at least as far as I know, this is what you have to do. If there's an easier way, someone please tell me. So I open the inspector for that LogiX node, the dynamic impulse receiver with value. And we can see here that it has a component called dynamic impulse receiver with value of type dummy. So all we have to do is attach a LogiX node that is a dynamic impulse receiver with value, and we actually have to select the type that we want to use. In this case, well, I was doing integer, but I think I'm going to do color as a demonstration. So dynamic impulse receiver with value of type color, and we delete the original component, and of course it disappeared. So all we have to do is use the LogiX tooltip, select that, and do a reveal nodes. Now you can see this is yellow because it has type color. So I'm just going to change my trigger to also use a color. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is create a sphere again, and it's going to receive a impulse, dynamic impulse that sets its color. I will just grab the that'd be the albedo color on the PBS metallic component, right? So when it receives an impulse, we just do a write action, take the color and the impulse, and we're going to write that into albedo color. And of course we need to give it a name, which the obvious name here is set color. And the same as before, we have to make sure that this LogiX, especially the dynamic impulse receiver node, is packed into the hierarchy that we're going to be targeting with the sender. And just go ahead and pack this in there. Now if I send this sphere a message, set color, that you saw the logics we put on the sphere that just receives an impulse with value and sets the color. This just sends an impulse with value, sets the color. If I hit pulse, this should turn black because the color is 0. And it does. So that works. And the same as before, if I go in and just make a whole bunch of copies of the sphere, the impulse will go to all of them. So we have a bunch of spheres, and I set its color to something different. There goes all of them without changing any of the logics. Now, I'll do something a little more complicated here. Let's say that I want to set all the spheres to a random color, but not the same random color, because what fun would that be? I want everyone to be a different color, which means we need a for loop. Helps if I use the right tooltip. We need some slot nodes, like number of children and getChild. And we need a reference to that slot, which we have right there, but I can't just hook it up to that. So there we go. That's the reference to the color spheres thing. Take that slot, get the child. We're going to want to generate a random color. And what do you know? We even have a node for random color. That's handy. Now, the dynamic impulse, instead of going to the object that contains all of these, the impulse is going to go to one child in specific. And that should be it. If we run this, it should loop through all of the spheres and send a dynamic impulse to each one setting its color to a random color. So of course it doesn't work. Let's see, what did I do wrong here? Oh, I didn't hook up the slot that I'm getting the children count from, so that was always 0. That would not be very effective now, would it? Okay, try that again. There. They all go to a random color. And notice I did not have to change the logics that are on these spheres at all to change the function, because each of these spheres has a function called setColor, and we are just calling that function basically. So it doesn't matter what you're setting the color to, or if you're setting them all to the same color or all the different colors. If you use the dynamic impulse trigger with value, you can have all the spheres you want. And if I go make more spheres, no problem. Don't have to change any logics at all. So I just tripled the number of spheres, hit the impulse. It works on all of them without changing any of the logics.